Mindfulness. Not long ago, I was at an elementary school working with a teacher. I was impressed. His content knowledge was solid, and so was his pedagogy. There was just one thing that caught me off guard. He singled out the only black male in the class for misbehavior, even though this child's behavior was in line with everyone else's. I couldn't help but wonder what made them decide to single out this child. The teacher even asked me to follow the child out of the classroom because he can't be trusted. Well, I was curious, how bad could this child be? So I followed him. In the hallway, another adult stopped to shout at the child, "Remember, this is a break, not a vacation." When I caught up with the child, I found him in the bathroom picking up wet paper towels off the floor. He just looked at me, shook his head, and said, "The janitors have too much to do already." It's quite the contrast, isn't it? The suspicion of the adults versus the empathy of this child. Now, I've been in the field of education for years now, first as a classroom teacher, and then after getting my MBA as a corporate trainer, and I'm still amazed at the impact of teachers on students. Early on in my own career, I didn't understand the impact I could have on others. Unfortunately, this is all too common, not just in education, but in all aspects of life. In this instance, I couldn't help but wonder what impact these adults were having on how the child perceived himself. What made these adults single out this black child from his white peers? Were they even aware they were treating him differently? Maybe you can think of your own story of bias regarding race, age, gender, or some other way we classify one another. Maybe the people in your stories didn't consider themselves biased either. In these stories, there seems to be a disconnect between how people think and how they act. Where does this disconnect come from? It comes from the difference between our conscious thinking and our unconscious thinking. Our conscious thoughts are the ones we're aware of. Our unconscious thoughts are the ones we don't even know we have. Like an iceberg, we have large parts of our mind that are hidden from sight or unconscious. Because we don't even know we have these thoughts, we act on them automatically. Sometimes that's helpful. They can serve as mental shortcuts for us. For instance, my thoughts about driving are unconscious because I've done it so often. When I come to a red light, I don't have to consciously deliberate about whether to stop. I just put my foot on the brake. Sometimes, though, these unconscious thoughts can lead to negative actions. When we apply our unconscious thinking to dealing with other people, we can cause big problems. When our unconscious thoughts contain a bias against a group, we can treat some people unfairly without even realizing it. We have lots of evidence these unconscious biases are real and widespread. Harvard put together something called Project Implicit. And for the project, they gathered responses from millions of people through implicit association tests, or IATs. These tests are designed to uncover our automatic preferences for one group over another. The results of these validated tests, overwhelmingly, respondents prefer white over black, thin over fat, straight over gay, young over old, and abled over disabled people. A big problem is that many of us like to think we're free from bias. On a conscious level, we may be. Once you go into our unconscious minds, though, it's a whole different story. There, it's not a question of whether we have bias. It's a question of which ones we have and how strong they are. When I first started investigating unconscious biases, I took these same IETs myself, and I showed a strong bias for white, thin, and straight people, no preference for young versus old, fortunately, and a moderate preference for abled people. All of us have these biases. It's just a question of which ones we have. Despite our best intentions, in our unconscious minds, we believe some people are inferior to others. That's a huge reason why we still have so much discrimination today. Now, these unconscious biases are not our fault. We didn't choose to have them. They come from cultural conditioning. We've been socialized since birth by authority figures in our lives, as well as the media, to view the world in a certain way. This includes how we view other people, as well as how we view ourselves. So, I'm not here to talk about blame. I am here to talk about recognizing our biases and doing something about them, because they hurt all of us. We can see an example of the damage done in hiring practices. The University of Chicago Business School sent out resumes to employers that were identical, except for the names. Some resumes had white names like Greg and Emily. Others had black names like Lakeisha and Jamal. The resumes with white names were 50% more likely to receive a call back for an interview. What this study tells us is that unconscious bias means people of color don't get the career opportunities they should. What's more, white people suffer as well. Their organizations aren't nearly as strong as they could be because they're not hiring the best possible talent. So, when we let unconscious bias make our decisions for us, all of us lose. It's been pretty heavy so far. Let's get to the good news. The good news is there's hope we can change. Two researchers out of Central Michigan University, Adam Lukey and Brian Gibson, made a startling discovery. They found that a brief mindfulness practice dramatically cut down on unconscious bias. They took a group of white college students and gave them an IAT to assess their bias for race and age. Before they did that, they split them in two groups. One group listened to a history lesson. The other group did a brief mindfulness practice. In this case, they spent 10 minutes focusing on the sensations in their bodies, nothing else. So what the beating of their heart felt like and the breath moving in and out of the body. Then all the students took the IAT. Now, the group that listened to the history lesson, the control group, performed as you might expect a group of young white people to perform. They showed strong bias against both the elderly and against people of color. The surprise was from the mindfulness group. They showed much less bias regarding both race and age. Now, this might seem really surprising because there doesn't seem to be a connection, does there? Connection between paying attention to the sensations in your bodies and reducing your biases. The key to understanding the connection lies in understanding what mindfulness itself is. So, mindfulness is paying attention on purpose with curiosity. Mindfulness is a state of being in which we're focusing on something in the present moment, and we are choosing what to focus on, rather than reacting out of habit. We're also taking our familiar way of viewing the world through a lens of judgment and evaluation, and replacing it with a lens of curiosity and openness. There's a quote by Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, that sheds light on mindfulness. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. Normally, we find that space to be cramped because our instincts take over and we end up with no space between that stimulus or an event in our lives and how we respond to it, how we deal with that event. What mindfulness does is create that space for us. It does so by inserting awareness. Awareness of our automatic reactions as well as what's actually happening in the present moment. Once we have this awareness, we have the ability to choose our response rather than react out of habit. Another way to think about mindfulness is to consider a raging river. This river represents our thoughts and emotions, including our unconscious biases. Normally, we're like the people on the raft. We just get carried along by that surging current. We're not in control, we're just trying to hang in there. What mindfulness does is remove us from that raging river of our own thoughts and emotions. We become the calm observer on the bank of the shore. Notice we're not stopping the river or even necessarily slowing it down. What we are doing, though, is changing our relationship with our thoughts and emotions. We're creating space between us and them so we can choose which thoughts to follow and which ones to let slide by. The students in the experiment who practiced mindfulness were able to remove themselves from that raging river of their own thoughts and emotions. They weren't being tossed around by undercurrents of unconscious bias. From there, they had the choice of how to respond in the present moment rather than reacting out of habit. More choice meant less bias. Now, the researchers saw these results and they were surprised. Practicing mindfulness for 10 minutes had made a huge impact on people's beliefs, but would it change behavior? Would it change how we treat one another? So they set up another study to answer that question. In this one, again with white college students, they split the students in two groups. One group had the privilege of listening to someone describe the countryside. Then the other group did a short mindfulness practice again. Then all of them played what's called the trust game. The trust game is designed to find out who people will trust with their money based on only seeing headshots of other people. The purpose is to find out how much more participants will trust members of one race over another. So the control group gave 14% more of their money to white people over black people, again, just based on seeing headshots. The mindfulness group gave a mere 3% more, hardly any difference at all. So the first study showed us that mindfulness can have a huge impact on belief. This study shows us that mindfulness can have a huge impact on biased behavior. What these two studies together suggest is we have a powerful way to overcome our most ingrained biases, biases that many of us might not even want to admit we have. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that a single dose of practicing mindfulness won't cure us. The effects wear off, so we need to practice regularly. Now, practice itself is simple. All you need to do is focus on one thing in the present moment, say the sensations of your breathing or the sounds you hear. And then when your mind wanders off, which it will, you bring it back without judging yourself and focus on this thing with curiosity again. Simple concept, kind of hard to execute because our minds like to think. They like to rehash scenes from the past. They also like to create scenarios of what could happen in the future. Our minds also love to judge. It's our mind's way of creating order out of the world around us. But this is precisely what perpetuates unconscious bias, relying on our conditioned way of viewing the world. So that's why it's both so important and so difficult to practice mindfulness. To make it easier on ourselves, let's practice with others. Just like physical exercise is easier to do if you commit to doing it with someone else, let's practice mindfulness together. Some schools and businesses are already doing this. They're taking advantage of the other benefits of mindfulness, like increased emotional intelligence, stress reduction, greater focus. Let's see all businesses and schools start each and every day with 10 minutes of mindfulness. That way, they can get those benefits as well as reducing biases. We can also practice at home with family and friends. Now, if we practice, all of us benefit. We bring more awareness into our day-to-day situations, and we reduce our own biases. We can also recognize when other people are getting pulled under by their own unconscious biases. From there, we can take action to fix the situations. By doing so, we can leverage everyone's full potential. We can make our companies more productive. Hiring managers can look at resumes with fresh eyes and hire the best possible talent. Coworkers can regard each other with more trust and willingness to collaborate. We can make our schools more inclusive. Students can look at those who are different from them with curiosity rather than judgment. Think about the child I mentioned earlier. Consider how his experience might be different if the adults around him practice mindfulness. How would the child regard himself if the adults around him viewed him as a person whose potential they wanted to develop, rather than a troublemaker who needed surveillance? What would that mean for the rest of us? if this child viewed himself as a valued contributor to the world rather than a threat to it. Down the road, if the hiring managers who look at his resume are practicing mindfulness, he'll get the career opportunities he deserves. In the meantime, let's all of us practice mindfulness so we get the benefits here and now. The key is that we actually practice, and practice regularly. Anton Chekhov said it best: knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice. Let's get started on this today. The child's future and ours depend on it.